Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So, imagine, if you will, standing on the promenade of this glittering seaside resort in the 1830s.
Right, the ultimate playground of British royalty.
Exactly. I mean, the sea breeze literally carries the scent of expensive perfumes and imported tobaccos. You've got aristocrats just parading past you in these beautiful open carriages.
And the economy there is built entirely on leisure, endless gambling, the theater, lavish balls.
Yeah, but here's the catch. If you take a short walk, like peeling back just one layer of this opulent veneer and step just a few narrow streets away from the Grand Marine Pavilion, the whole environment violently shifts.
It's a complete contrast.
It really is.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're unmasking this hidden underbelly of staggering poverty, rampant cholera, and just absolute despair.
It's a profound geographical paradox, honestly. You have this classic tale of two cities, but it's compressed into one highly volatile, geographically concentrated seaside town. The affluent and the destitute are breathing the exact same salt air, yet they are separated by this invisible, almost impenetrable social membrane.
Right, and navigating that membrane is exactly where we're heading today. We're doing a deep dive into an incredible historical account.
The Berni Bannier book, right?
Yes, exactly. Into the Streets and Lanes. A History of the Brighton and Hove Town Mission, 1849-1989. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore how a small, incredibly dedicated group of citizens looked at that grim, hidden reality of their city and, well, they decided they weren't going to look away.
I decided to act.
Yeah, they built an enduring safety net, brick by brick, door by door.
And what makes this history so vital for you as a listener, especially if you study urban missions or social work, is that we are looking at a 140-year case study in institutional adaptability.
Which is huge.
Exactly. How does a grassroots social and spiritual movement survive massive tectonic societal shifts? I mean, we are going to watch this mission navigate the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, the psychological devastation of 2 world wars, all the way up to the rise of the modern welfare state.
And high-rise isolation, right?
Yes, exactly. It is a masterclass in how methods have to evolve when the physical landscape of poverty changes.
So to really understand the genesis of this movement, we have to immerse ourselves in the socioeconomic whiplash of the 1830s and 1840s. Brighton had been transformed from this obscure little fishing village into a booming resort town.
Largely because of the Prince Regent, right? Later, King George IV.
Yeah, exactly. He built the Royal Pavilion, which is this wildly extravagant, sumptuous Indo-Chinese palace right near the sea. It became the absolute epicenter of high society.
But the entire economic ecosystem of the town was precariously balanced on royal patronage. And then, in 1837, an 18-year-old Queen Victoria takes the throne.
And that changes everything.
Completely.
Yeah.
She introduces an entirely different cultural tone. I mean, she visits Brighton a few times, but she finds the whole atmosphere incredibly claustrophobic.
Right, because the Royal Pavilion was built for decadent, exclusive parties, not for raising a young, growing family.
Exactly. Plus, because it was situated right in the middle of town, the public could easily just peer over the walls. She felt like she was living in a fishbowl.
So by February 1845, she makes this definitive decision to just sever her links with the area.
And she doesn't just quietly stop visiting, right?
Oh, no, she completely guts the place. The Royal Pavilion was stripped of its valuables. I'm talking furniture, carpets, porcelain, massive oil paintings.
Wow.
Yeah, it took 143 horse van loads to move everything to Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. By 1850, the whole estate is sold to the council for £53,000.
Which creates a massive economic vacuum for a town that built its entire identity around serving the monarchy.
Exactly. You have a population that had increased sixfold since 1801, just sitting there wondering if their booming resort is about to collapse into a ghost town.
And you can feel that anxiety in the historical records. But the salvation of Brighton's economy actually arrives not by royal decree, but through a marvel of industrial engineering.
Ah, the train.
Right, September 21st, 1841. The Iron Road. The first steam train arrives from London, billowing smoke out of the Patcham Tunnel.
This completely rewrites the spatial economics of the region. The journey time from London drops to an astonishing 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Which is mind-blowing for the time.
Right. So wealthy merchants and stockbrokers realize they don't just have to visit the seaside. They can actually live there and commute to London. It's really the dawn of the wealthy commuter class.
But the train democratizes travel too. I mean, fares plummet. By 1861, Brighton is seeing 250,000 annual visitors.
That's a huge influx.
Oh, it's staggering. On Easter Monday alone, 132,000 people flood into the town on cheap day excursions.
So it's a massive infrastructure explosion. But the influx of wealthy commuters and day trippers creates this immediate, desperate demand for a massive service underclass.
Right, because all those aristocrats and tourists require an army of labor.
Exactly. Domestic staff, stable boys, and an entire gig economy of specialized transport workers.
Like the flymen.
Yeah, the flymen who drove those one-horse-like carriages known as flies. And you have the bath chairmen who literally pulled wheeled chairs for invalids and the elderly along the promenade.
And don't forget the goatmen.
Right, the goatmen. They operated goat-drawn chaises to entertain the wealthy children.
So all these gig workers are flooding into the town seeking wages, but the housing infrastructure just doesn't exist for them, so you get the proliferation of these hidden slums.
Which Charles Dickens actually witnessed firsthand, didn't he?
Yeah, he was actually living in Brighton at the Bedford Hotel around this time, writing David Copperfield.
Wow.
So he's looking out at the glittering sea, but he is fiercely aware of this twilight world just a few streets away.
Yeah, the guidebooks of the era actually warned tourists about it. Like, the books meant to steer tourists toward the pleasant sights contained explicit warnings.
What did they say?
They advised visitors that if they wandered off Church Street, they'd encounter scenes of profound degradation. They described streets full of, quote, hideous old women, drunken old men, young men, and mere boys, hopelessly intoxicated, reeling and staggering in the road.
And that geographical proximity of these two worlds is the defining tragedy of Victorian urbanism. I mean, extreme wealth and extreme poverty shared the exact same air.
But the affluent class just didn't see it.
Right. They possessed a profound psychological blindness to the suffering that made their leisure possible. The people driving their carriages and cleaning their hotel rooms returned at night to unpaved, open sewer streets.
This dynamic feels eerily relevant to anyone living in a modern tech hub or a major tourist destination today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you can have a neighborhood of ultra-luxury condominiums, and literally one block over, there is an entrenched encampment of unhoused individuals. The two populations share a zip code, but their daily realities never intersect.
They navigate entirely different dimensions of the exact same city.
Yeah, highly accurate parallel. So, historically, breaking through that psychological blindness usually requires a catalyst, right?
Yes. A moment that exposes the systemic failure so starkly that it just can no longer be ignored. And for Brighton, one of those catalysts was this profound interaction experienced by the Reverend Joseph Sorton.
Okay, set the scene for us. Who was Reverend Sorton?
So he was a highly respected, very eloquent preacher in town. The history records him visiting a dying man in one of these severe slums.
Okay.
He sits beside this man's bed and asks what seems, to a clergyman at least, like the most fundamental, foundational question possible. He asks the dying man if he knows who Jesus Christ is.
And the man's response is just heartbreaking.
It really is. The man, in complete, unironic sincerity, replies, "Please, sir, can you tell me in what street he lives?"
No, in what street he lives.
Right. When you really analyze that quote, it is a devastating indictment of the institutional church of the 1840s.
Oh.
It reveals an absolute vacuum of spiritual and educational care.
Because the church wasn't reaching these people at all.
Not at all. You have to understand the theological and economic landscape of the time. The grand established churches were packed on Sundays with the wealthy and the middle classes, but those churches operated on a system of pew rents.
You literally had to pay for your seat.
Exactly.
Which inherently engineers a sanctuary where only the affluent are welcome. I mean, if you were a flyman whose wages depend entirely on whether it rained that week, you aren't renting a pew.
You can't afford to. The architecture and the economics of the church actively repelled the working poor.
They were basically priced out of salvation.
Exactly. The institutional church expected the poor to clean up, put on a suit they didn't own, and walk into a daunting, formal building where they would just be looked down upon.
Right. And Reverend Sorton's interaction basically proved that this top-down approach was a complete failure.
Completely. The dying man didn't even possess the baseline cultural vocabulary to understand the clergyman's question.
In what street he lives.
Yeah.
It really gives you chills when you think about the sheer isolation that implies. So a realization dawns among a few influential citizens. If the established institutions are failing to reach these hidden streets, The strategy has to change completely.
You have to go boots on the ground.
Which brings us to the autumn of 1849 and the formation of a radical grassroots solution.
Right. A group led by an influential banker named Robert Bevan realizes that building another grand stone church won't solve anything.
The solution isn't architectural.
No, it's relational. In December 1849, they form what becomes the Brighton Town Mission. And they make this foundational, highly controversial decision right at the inception. They decide the work must be explicitly undenominational.
Now, we hear the word undenominational today, and it sounds very standard, almost corporate,
Yeah.
But in the 1840s, this was a massive risk, wasn't it?
Oh, it was borderline scandalous. The mid-19th century was an era of intense theological tribalism. You had the Anglican establishment fiercely clashing with free church nonconformists. You had the Oxford movement causing deep divisions. So for Robert Bevan to gather Anglicans, Baptists, Methodists, and Congregationalists in one room and say, we're going to check our denominational flags at the door.
That required immense diplomatic skill.
Absolutely. Their sole unifying aim was to proclaim Christ to the destitute, not to funnel converts into a specific congregation. It became the oldest Christian organization in the area that continuously united different denominations in a common work.
It's a beautifully stripped-down mandate. And their operational tactics were just as revolutionary, weren't they?
Yes, they employed what they called lay agency. Instead of sending ordained priests in formal vestments who would inherently represent the upper-class establishment, they hired ordinary working-class men of approved character.
Men the community could actually relate to.
Exactly. These men were given full-time salaries to simply walk the streets. Their entire job description was to go from house to house, room by crowded lodging room, reading to people and building relationships.
To grasp the scale of this strategy, you really have to look at the numbers. Brighton had a population of around 60,000 at this point.
Right.
These lay agents were assigned specific, tightly drawn districts. The expectation was hyper-local intimacy. A missioner was expected to know the names and the daily struggles of everyone in his district. The stallholders, the stable boys, the exhausted mothers.
But they weren't just knocking on the doors of quiet homes. They were intentionally walking into some of the most hostile environments imaginable.
Yeah, the pubs.
Yes. The historical records provide a statistic that perfectly illustrates the environment. In 1860, Brighton had just 111 bakers, but it had 479 pubs and beer shops.
Wait, 479 pubs compared to 111 bakers? That is insane.
I know. Some streets had 20 or more establishments just pouring cheap alcohol.
That ratio tells you everything you need to know about the coping mechanisms of the Victorian underclass. I mean, when you are living in squalor, where the drinking water is literally contaminated with cholera.
And you are facing a grueling 14-hour workday just to survive.
Right. Alcohol isn't a luxury. It is the cheapest, most accessible anesthetic available. The pub basically functioned as the living room of the slums.
It was the only place that was warm and lit. Consequently, the level of drunkenness was staggering.
Which raises a serious logistical and psychological question for me. The missioners made it a priority to visit these pubs, right?
Sure did.
So, if you put yourself in the shoes of a working-class lay agent, walking into a Victorian slum pub where you represent temperance, religion, and essentially a disruption to their only source of comfort, you know you are going to be hated.
Oh, completely.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Walking into a pub where you know you're hated takes a ridiculous amount of bravery. What was the driving force that pushed them through those doors, and how do they actually survive the sheer hostility?
Well, the driving force was an incarnational theology. They firmly believed that if the gospel meant anything, it had to be delivered to the people furthest from the safety of a church pew. But your point about the danger is completely valid. It was incredibly hostile. There is a specific incident recorded in the mission's history that perfectly encapsulates the friction and the eventual breakthrough of this method.
Oh, the beer in the face story.
Yes. So, a missioner walks into a crowded pub and attempts to address the room. Almost immediately, a patron turns and throws a full pint of beer directly into the missioner's face.
It's the ultimate public humiliation. And the owner of the pub immediately intervenes.
Yeah, right. But he doesn't kick out the patron. He tells the missioner to leave because he's bad for business and causing a riot.
But then something crazy happens.
Exactly. This is where the sociological dynamic flips. The other patrons in the pub, the very men you would expect to laugh the missioner out the door, actually step in to defend him.
Wait, really?
Yes. One of the men stands up and addresses the rest of the pub, saying, It is no small thing for the gentleman to come here in this way to try to do us good and then to have beer thrown in his face. I think we ought to listen to what he has to say.
That is amazing.
The patrons literally force the publican to let the man stay, and the missioner delivers his message to a perfectly silent room.
It's a stunning reversal. How do you analyze that shift? I mean, why did these hardened men suddenly rally around the guy who just walked in uninvited?
Because the missioner proved his authenticity through shared suffering. He didn't stand on a safe, clean street corner yelling at them through a megaphone.
He entered their domain.
Exactly. He breathed their air. And when he was assaulted, when he took the beer in the face, he didn't retaliate and he didn't run away.
Wow.
In marginalized communities, authority isn't granted by a title or a clerical collar. Authority is earned through vulnerability. By absorbing the hostility without breaking rank, he proved he wasn't just a privileged tourist judging them from above. He earned the right to be heard.
That is the power of physical presence. But as these missioners embed themselves deeper into these communities, they hit a brutal wall.
Right.
As they get into the homes and the pubs, they realize something fundamental. You cannot just preach to a starving person.
The limitations of purely verbal evangelism become immediately apparent. I mean, when you are sitting in a room where a family has no coal for the fire and a child is visibly suffering from malnutrition, attempting to minister to their spiritual needs without addressing their physical agony is not just ineffective.
It borders on cruelty.
Exactly, which leads to a massive operational shift in the late 19th century.
The mission has to scale up its empathy. They have to build a holistic infrastructure of care. And the operational power behind this shift largely came from the women of Brighton, right?
It did. A woman named Mrs. Holcomb started a prayer fellowship that by 1862 had evolved into the formidable Ladies' Auxiliary.
Within this group emerges an absolute powerhouse of a leader, Miss Anne Padwick.
Miss Padwick is one of those historical figures who simply refused to be constrained by the patriarchal limitations of her era. From 1860 until her death in 1899, she was the strategic engine of the auxiliary.
She didn't just organize bake sales to raise modest funds, did she?
No, not at all. She utilized her own personal wealth to independently finance a missioner.
This is fascinating because it shows women bypassing the formal, male-dominated church hierarchy by using capital to directly impact the streets.
Right. And Miss Padwick was highly strategic. She didn't just throw money at poverty generically. She analyzed the local economy and identified a deeply vulnerable subculture.
The gig workers we discussed earlier.
Yes. She launched a specialized outreach specifically for the cabmen, flymen, and goatmen.
It demonstrates an incredibly sophisticated understanding of labor dynamics because these men didn't have regular hours.
Right. They waited on the promenade in the freezing rain for hours on the off chance a tourist needed a ride. They were exhausted, perpetually cold, and their families lived on volatile, unpredictable wages.
So what did she do?
Miss Padwick created a cabmen's mission tailored specifically to their schedules. They rented a dedicated room in Sheepside where these men could go for a hot drink, warmth, and community without the pressure of the pub environment.
That is brilliant. And as they are providing these safe harbors for adults, they are simultaneously confronting the sheer tragedy of the children in the slums.
Yes, the kids.
You have to remember, this is before the 1870 Education Act. There is no state-mandated free public schooling.
Right.
The history highlights a missionary named John Bailey Haynes, who joined the ranks in 1851 at the age of 24. He is walking his district, dodging insults and dealing with the chaos of the pubs, and he keeps tripping over all these idle children wandering the streets while their parents work.
And Haynes embodies the entrepreneurial spirit of the early mission. He doesn't form a committee to study the problem of childhood illiteracy.
He doesn't wait for the government to pass legislation.
Exactly. He takes immediate, localized action. He starts bringing these street kids directly into his own private home to teach them the alphabet.
The demand is so overwhelming that his house can't even hold them. He eventually has to rent a larger property in New England Street just to contain all the children craving instruction.
Which ultimately evolves into a full-fledged mission hall. The desperation for education and structure in these communities was profound.
There's an anecdote from 1887 that perfectly captures this desperation. The Sunday school superintendent goes into a back room to check on the infant classes because there's a severe shortage of adult volunteer teachers that day.
Right.
He asks one of the workers who is managing the infants, and the worker replies, "Only 2 boys, as I have no one else to send."
And consider the scene he discovers when he opens that door.
Oh, it's wild. He opens the door and finds a 10-year-old boy named Arthur.
A 10-year-old child.
Yeah. He is standing on a chair so he can be seen, holding a scripture card, and he has 60 infants sitting on the floor in absolute perfect silence, listening to him teach.
That image is both beautiful and just heartbreaking. It reveals the intense premature maturity forced upon children living in poverty.
Yeah, the parentification of a 10-year-old taking responsibility for 60 infants.
But it also highlights something deeper about the psychology of those children. I mean, why were 60 infants perfectly silent for a peer?
Because they were profoundly thirsty for order.
Exactly. The slum streets were chaotic, violent, and unpredictable. The mission hall was one of the only predictable, safe, and structured environments in their entire lives. They respected Arthur because he was providing the structure they craved.
These mission halls truly became the epicenters of their respective neighborhoods. They evolved far beyond Sunday services into full-blown, multi-service community hubs.
And the mission developed incredibly innovative mechanisms to address the physical suffering. For example, they utilized hospital and dispensary tickets.
How did those work?
Well, this was a crucial mechanism before the creation of the National Health Service. Hospitals were often funded by wealthy subscribers. If you subscribed, you were giving tickets or votes that allowed you to recommend a poor person for admission or free medicine.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so the mission acquired these tickets and distributed them to the destitute who were genuinely ill, effectively acting as a triage system to get the poorest citizens past the gatekeepers of Victorian medicine.
That is so smart. And then there was the Blanket Lending Society. This is an absolutely brilliant piece of social engineering, if you ask me.
It really is.
In the autumn and winter, the mission would lend out heavy, warm blankets to families for a tiny deposit of just a few pence. And here is the genius part. When the weather warmed up in the spring, if the family returned the blanket clean and in good condition, they got their deposit back.
It was a highly effective system of localized mutual aid. It kept families from freezing during brutal coastal winters, but the deposit mechanism also subtly encouraged financial responsibility and basic hygiene in environments where sanitation was incredibly difficult to maintain.
I mean, we look at that today as like an early form of mutual aid networks or a modern social services.
Definitely. A missioner actually wrote in his journal that he literally dreaded to think what the poor would have suffered without the Blanket Lending Society and the soup kitchen during severe weather.
This entire holistic approach was deeply rooted in a core philosophy championed by the prominent evangelical statesman Lord Shaftesbury. The mission operated on his guiding ethos. We cannot hope to evangelize the masses unless there is a practical Christianity as well as a preached Christianity.
Practical Christianity, that is the defining ethos. But this raises an essential question about the relationship between grassroots social work and top-down systemic change.
Right.
The mission was in the trenches doing ground-level triage, handing out blankets, giving out hospital tickets, teaching children to read, but you cannot do that work for decades without becoming intimately aware of the structural, architectural failures of the city.
You see the rot behind the walls.
Exactly. Grassroots social work functions like a pressure gauge on a boiler. The missioners gathered the raw data of suffering. They documented the mortality rates, the cholera outbreaks in unpaved alleys, the sheer impossibility of staying healthy in a damp, windowless basement.
And they didn't just keep it to themselves.
No, they persisted in bringing these grim realities to the attention of the authorities. And eventually, this localized pressure contributed to massive systemic legislative changes.
Like Disraeli's 1875 Public Health and Sanitation legislation.
Yes. This legislation finally gave local councils the power to demolish the absolute worst slums. In Brighton, this led to the demolition of notorious areas like Dorset Street and Nottingham Street, paving the way for better housing.
Ground-level social work, basically serving as the canary in the coal mine, forcing government legislation. They forced the government's hand by proving, with daily evidence, that the current conditions were fundamentally unsurvivable.
But just as the mission builds this robust, localized safety net and the worst of the slums are cleared, the calendar flips to the 20th century.
And the world, quite literally, explodes.
Yeah.
You have to look at how a hyper-local town mission survives the absolute crucible of global industrial warfare.
It requires a sudden, massive pivot. To understand the shock to the system, consider the outbreak of World War I, August 3rd, 1914.
The juxtaposition in the historical record here is eerie. It's a bank holiday Monday in Brighton. The weather is glorious.
Right.
The town is bursting at the seams with tourists. People are riding Volk's electric railway along the beach, sitting in deck chairs, completely packing the excursion trains. It is a portrait of perfect British leisure.
And yet, just across the English Channel, Europe is teetering on the brink of total devastation.
The cognitive dissonance must have been deafening. Within weeks, Brighton transforms from a holiday resort to a massive military staging post.
Thousands of soldiers are marshaled through the town on their way to the front lines. The missioners immediately recognize that the needs of their city have radically changed.
Right.
They realize these young men, many of whom are terrified, young and far from home, desperately need support before they are shipped off to the trenches.
So the missioners get permission from the military authorities to access the camps and the staging areas. They distribute massive amounts of literature, thousands of Bibles and New Testaments.
And there's a sensory detail in the history that just stops you in your tracks.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
The text notes that the missioners would be walking the streets of Brighton or visiting the wounded in the military hospitals that had sprung up, and they could literally hear the deep rhythmic rumble of the artillery guns echoing across the English Channel from France.
That auditory detail places the macro trauma of global industrial warfare right on the doorstep of their localized mission. I mean, they are handing out a Bible to a young man, knowing that the guns they can hear in the distance are exactly where he is heading.
And the missioners responded to this immense psychological weight with profound practical hospitality. They didn't just preach to the soldiers, they took them into their own homes.
That's amazing.
They introduced them to local families, providing a brief, vital sense of normalcy and friendship before the men were sent into the meat grinder of the Western Front.
And the suffering wasn't contained to the battlefield, obviously. The home front reality was incredibly grim, especially for the working poor that the mission had always served.
Yeah.
By January 1918, the logistical strain of the war brings Brighton to the breaking point. There is a massive march to the Brighton Food Committee because the poor are facing actual starvation.
It highlights a tragic historical constant. In times of national scarcity, bureaucratic rationing systems often fail the most vulnerable first. The shops were empty, and the distribution of what little food remained was highly inequitable.
The societal divisions that the war was supposed to erase were, in many ways, exacerbated by hunger.
And through all of this, the fear of Zeppelin raids, the agonizing lists of casualties in the newspapers, the literal lack of bread, the lay agents just kept walking their assigned districts. They became stabilizing anchors in a world that felt entirely unmoored.
There is a beautiful, quiet memory recorded in the history that captures the essence of this stabilizing force. A woman recalls a moment from her childhood during this era when she was just 3 or 4 years old.
Oh, this is a great story.
Her mother takes her to visit an aged aunt living in Elm Grove. While they are there, a town missioner arrives. He doesn't barge in with a loud theatrical sermon. He simply sits down in the quiet room, talks gently to the elderly aunt, opens his Bible, reads to her, and prays with her.
Right.
This little girl watches this and thinks, this gentleman must really love Jesus.
The sheer kindness and consistency of that single, quiet, micro-interaction left such a profound psychological imprint on her that she spent the next several decades of her adult life financially supporting the mission.
That is the compounding power of incarnational presence. In times of profound global trauma, a simple act of consistent, gentle care becomes a psychological anchor.
Yeah.
That missioner didn't solve the geopolitical crisis of the war, and he couldn't fix the food shortages, but he solved the immediate crushing isolation of that elderly woman in that specific moment.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the centenary of the mission in 1949. They have survived 100 years. They navigated the cholera outbreaks of the 1850s, the economic panics, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression. And a man named Reverend Pitt Banerjee, who was of Indian origin and a highly respected vital figure on the executive committee, decides to calculate the quantifiable impact of their first century.
And he purposefully underestimates them just to ensure the claims are ironclad.
Even with his conservative estimates, the metrics of their engagement are staggering.
They defy belief. In 100 years, the mission conducted 2 million house-to-house visits. They distributed 3 million tracts. They gave out 500,000 Bibles, and they held 8,000 open-air meetings.
If you pause and truly analyze that first metric, 2 million house visits.
2 million door knocks. Let's just pause on that. That is an incomprehensible volume of human interaction. Sure. That is not broadcasting a radio message or dropping leaflets from a plane.
No, it's very manual.
Exactly. That is standing face-to-face with another human being, reading their body language, assessing their immediate physical needs, and entering their personal space 2 million distinct times.
It represents an oceanic reservoir of local knowledge and earned trust. And as the mission moves into its second century, into the post-war era of the 1950s and 1960s, the demographics of the leadership begin to evolve organically to meet new societal needs.
We see female missioners officially taking on much more prominent, formally recognized roles in visitation and counseling.
Right, you have dedicated women like Miss Stone, Mrs. Matsell, and later Mrs. Thompson leading the charge in deep relational pastoral care.
And the innovation in how they reach the vulnerable continues to adapt. Consider the story of Ron Bridle. In 1946, Ron, who everyone affectionately comes to know as Uncle Ron, returns from serving in the armed forces.
And his father takes him to visit the Royal Alexandra Children's Hospital.
Now, pediatric hospital life in the 1940s was incredibly austere. The wards were strictly managed, parents had highly restricted visiting hours, and the children were often lonely and terrified.
So what does Ron do?
Ron brings a flannel graph with him and uses engaging stories and music to break the gloom for these sick kids.
It is a brilliant adaptation of Sunday school methods for a medical environment. He recognized a pocket of severe emotional isolation and created a localized solution.
He officially joins the mission staff in 1966 and launches the Sunshine Club, sending out quizzes, letters, and scripture to over 300 sick children, building a remote community for them. And his dedication was absolute. He was still visiting that exact same children's hospital 40 years later.
Uncle Ron perfectly illustrates the enduring nature of the individual calling. The tools change from a 10-year-old Arthur teaching infants in a Victorian slum hall to Uncle Ron using a flannel graph in a sterile post-war hospital ward, but the underlying mechanism of dedicated personal care remains identical.
The mission is also interfacing with much broader macro-level evangelical shifts during this time. For instance, the massive Billy Graham crusades come to the Dome in Brighton in 1963 and 1968.
Right, thousands of people are making decisions in these massive stadium-style events.
But the mission understands that the high of a massive crusade evaporates quickly without long-term support. So the missioners embed themselves deeply in the counseling and follow-up side of the crusades.
Bridging the gap between mass evangelism and local street-level discipleship.
Exactly. However, despite these localized successes and their ability to interface with global ministries, the mission is rapidly approaching an existential crisis.
Yes. As we move into the 1970s and 1980s, the very architectural fabric of Brighton and the structure of British society as a whole undergoes a radical, unprecedented transformation.
This is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. The mission survived cholera, extreme poverty, and the Blitz. But now, they have to face a completely different set of adversaries.
The challenges of affluence, urban planning, and structural isolation.
The physical landscape of the city is rewritten. The old crowded terraces south of Western Road, the very streets where the missioners had walked door to door for a century, had been heavily bombed during the war and are subsequently bulldozed.
And in their place rises the massive, concrete Churchill Square shopping complex.
The skyline is suddenly pierced by brutalist skyscrapers, like the Sussex Heights residential tower.
You cannot underestimate how much this architectural shift destroys the traditional model of community. You can't just walk down a vibrant, chaotic street and chat with the baker or the cabman anymore.
No, the population is lifted off the street level and sealed into high-rise towers behind locked security doors and intercoms. It's basically an architectural moat.
Furthermore, the sociology of the family has changed. The history notes that massive housing estates on the edge of town would sit completely quiet and deserted during the day.
Because, unlike the pre-war era, society had become highly mobile, and both parents were frequently out working to afford modern conveniences.
The casual, daily, street-level interaction that the lay agents relied upon had effectively been engineered out of existence. But the deeper crisis for the mission wasn't just architectural, it was political.
Right. This is the era of the fully realized welfare state. State agencies, professional social workers, and government councils are now handling the practical help.
The medical care, the blankets, the food, the housing.
Everything that the mission had essentially invented a century earlier, which forces the mission to ask a brutal existential question.
If the government is now providing the blanket, the hospital ticket, and the housing, are we obsolete?
Exactly. What is our purpose if the physical needs are met by the state? I want to explore a famous quote from the late 1950s by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. He famously declared to the British public, "We have never had it so good."
And purely from an economic and technological standpoint, he was largely right. Living standards, life expectancy, and consumer goods had skyrocketed.
But the author of our source history, Berni Bannier, juxtaposes Macmillan's optimism with the grim reality the missioners were still seeing on the ground. Bannier writes that the hardest of this new, affluent era included many broken, lonely, and frustrated lives.
Does material comfort actually make spiritual outreach harder?
That's the question. That juxtaposition highlights the defining paradox of the late 20th century. Material comfort often acts as a mask for profound spiritual poverty.
Well, when people are physically starving, their need is visceral, communal, and obvious. But when a family has a color, television, central heating, and a secure high-rise flat, they project an image of self-sufficiency.
Yet, behind those locked security doors, they can be suffering from crippling anxiety, addiction, and a profound lack of meaning.
A welfare check can keep you from freezing, but it cannot cure existential isolation.
The mission realized that with the state handling physical triage, they had to pivot their entire focus back to what they called man's deepest need, the spiritual and relational emptiness of modern life.
But the logistics of reaching those isolated people behind those locked doors were becoming an absolute nightmare.
Oh, completely.
Back in the 1880s, because of dense housing and large families, the ratio of missioners to the local population was roughly 1 to 18,000.
Which is already a lot.
Right. But by the 1980s, the population of the greater Brighton area had expanded so massively, and the financial models of employing full-time staff had shifted, that the ratio was an astonishing 1 missioner to 60,000 people.
It is an impossible mathematical equation. You simply cannot rely on the 1850s tactic of a single man slowly walking his district and knowing everyone's name when he is responsible for 60,000 highly mobile, transient individuals.
The mission had to adapt its tactics to engage with a high-volume society.
And their creativity in bridging this gap is brilliant. They realized they had to stop knocking on empty doors and go to where the crowds were naturally funneling. In 1988, they launched a massive, visually arresting poster campaign right on the main London platform at Brighton Station.
This station was seeing over 12 million passengers a year. They placed thought-provoking, spiritually challenging messages directly in the sightline of the exhausted commuters waiting for their trains.
They also recognized that the demographics of Brighton had shifted from a domestic resort to a highly international destination. Brighton had become a massive hub for language schools. Up to 12,000 international students and tourists were arriving weekly.
The history records an instance of a missionary simply eating his lunch in the concrete precinct of Churchill Square and striking up a deep theological conversation with 2 young men from Turkey.
The mission field was no longer just the local poor in the slums. The entire world was effectively walking through the center of Brighton.
And crucially, they refused to let the modern systems of incarceration hide the most broken members of society. They initiated dedicated visitation programs to youth detention centers.
There's a harrowing story of a young Brighton lad arrested for murder.
Yes. The town mission immediately sought out his devastated parents to offer comfort, and then a missioner started making regular, grueling visits to the young man in the detention center.
This individual effort expanded until they were arranging meetings where up to 25 detained youths would sit and listen to the missioners. They also established regular visits to Lewes Prison to encourage the men serving time there.
It demonstrates that their core DNA hadn't changed. They were still intentionally walking into the darkest, most hostile corners of society that the general public preferred to ignore.
But even with all these modern tactics, the station billboards, the prison visits, the precinct conversations, the 1 to 60,000 ratio was still structurally crushing. The leadership realized that the professionalized model, paying a tiny handful of experts to do all the evangelical heavy lifting for the entire city, was no longer sustainable.
Which leads to their ultimate survival strategy, the Breakout Initiative.
The Breakout Initiative was a logistical and theological masterstroke.
It really was. The mission realized they had to decentralize. They launched a program to train everyday Christians, plumbers, teachers, accountants, volunteers from local churches across the city.
They ran special weeks of intensive outreach during the summer, essentially giving ordinary people a crash course in practical theology, equipping them to do the visitation work, the counseling, and the street-level engagement.
It is so incredibly poetic when you look at the 140-year timeline. They effectively came full circle.
They did. Back in December 1849, the foundational revolutionary idea was lay agency. The belief that ordinary citizens, not just professional priests, had to take responsibility for the spiritual health of their city.
And in the 1980s, facing the impossible math of modern urban sprawl, their survival strategy was to return the mission back to the hands of the everyday citizen.
It perfectly proves that while the infrastructure, the architecture, and the technology of society change radically, the fundamental mechanism for solving our deepest human problems remains exactly the same. Individuals choosing to take personal responsibility for their neighbors.
Let's zoom out and consider this entire 140-year arc because the evolution is truly staggering.
Okay, let's do it.
We started our journey in the 1840s, standing in the shadows of the Indo-Chinese Royal Pavilion, surrounded by horse-drawn carriages, open sewers, and cholera in the slums.
And we end in the 1980s, standing in the shadows of the brutalist Sussex Heights skyscrapers, dealing with the psychological isolation of the welfare state and trying to reach 12 million train commuters.
The operational tools completely transformed. They evolved from driving goat chases for tourists to taking out advertising space on train platforms. They shifted from physically handing out coal and heavy blankets to navigating the complex psychological terrain of modern depression and addiction.
The landscape changed, the tools changed, but the core mandate, the stubborn refusal to look away, the command to go into the streets and lanes and look a hurting person in the eye remained absolutely identical.
And exploring that consistency leaves you with a profound final thought to ponder. Think back to the 1850s. Those original lay agents knew the exact names of the cabmen, the bakers, and the publicans on their specific streets.
They knew exactly who was hurting, who was drinking too much, and whose children were sick because they shared the physical space. They were a visible, daily presence in the chaos.
They were unavoidable, but in our hyper-connected but highly isolated digital era, we have engineered out the need for physical proximity.
Yeah, we can order our groceries to our door, work remotely from our living rooms, and be entertained by an algorithm for hours without ever speaking a single word to the neighbor on the other side of our wall.
So the question becomes, who is walking the streets and lanes of our modern digital communities? If the welfare state provides the housing and the algorithm provides the distraction, who's providing the friction of human connection? Who is willing to cross that invisible social membrane, look someone in the eye, and ask how they are really doing?
That is the ultimate question. The diagnostic tools of modern society might be able to show us what is physically or economically broken, but the muddy waters of human isolation require something far more hands-on than a policy change. It requires someone willing to step into the mess, someone willing to take a bit of beer in the face, metaphorically speaking, to break through the defensive walls we build around ourselves. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the streets of Brighton. We encourage you to step outside today, walk your own neighborhood, and look at your own city with an entirely new perspective.